it has about 1,100 square kilometer, where we live only in about 24.3% of the land. So in other words, of the 1,100 square kilometer, there are another 953 square kilometer available. That's across in Lantau and the area off of Kowloon all the way to the border of China. All right. Now, then what's the problem? Why is it we still short of land? The correct answer is because of the legacy of the colonial government of the UK, how to manage land. They decide that all the land in Hong Kong and Kowloon become the crown land, nobody owned land, and they would lease out the land for developer and housing, but withhold the ownership. Now that works well for Hong Kong and Kowloon, where the Britain possessed those land in perpetuity. But when they acquired the new territory in 1898, that considered this the rest of Hong Kong, they got a problem because they don't own those land. Those lands still owned by the Qing dynasty. So instead of owning them, they say, okay, people who live there, the indigenous village, they can maintain ownership of the land. They pay some nominal rental to the government, and they continue to use it. In the beginning, mostly as agricultural land for farming and so on. As time goes on, when the agricultural industry sort of disappear, those are no longer land doing productive farming, and the villagers begin to lease those land for business operation, like logistics industry, like car park, or some recycling industry. So after a while, those land became to be parceled out to different business operations, and then come the developers who began to build up land bank in the land in the new territory. So after a while, despite having this 950 square kilometer new territory, we noticed that there's a little wiggle room for the government to directly resume those land, although they can, and use them in the overall land planning process. Now, if you look at where we live now on this slide, the black color one are the urbanized area, and that basically in Hong Kong Island and the Kowloon Peninsula. And then the blue one are the new towns, the 9 new towns that have been beginning to be developed in the 1970s. And then there are the purple line, what they call the new development area. Those are smaller areas that the government began to develop about 10 years ago, and they're still in progress. Now, and the little orange patch in the middle of the sea is a phase 1 of the Lantau Tomorrow Vision. See, the entire Lantau Tomorrow government proposed have 1,700 square hectares to be reclaimed, but the first phase only 1,000 hectares, which is this orange patch here now. So the land available is physically available, is being occupied by various purposes, by the land, by the developers, by the villagers, and they became brownfield. Brownfield is nothing more than farmland that being converted to other purposes, business operation, parking lot, and so on. And then they are no longer agricultural land. And you see, if you walk around in Yuen Long area, you see this different type of occupation of the land. Some are using it as container, some are recycling industry, and some are even being used as basically a living community. They're not the land belong to the inhabitants, but they are land owned by the villagers or leased to developers. So let's take a look at break down the land into like what's the problem. I mentioned that there's only 24% that are being developed. That's about 27,000 hectares. And then there are about 52,000 hectares that are the country park or the wetland in Maipo. And the rest, we have about 32,000 hectares that are really still available for development. Now, what are these 32,000 hectares? 2,700 hectares are being occupied by the PLA, the People Liberation Army. About 1,300 now, they think it's about 1,400. It's a brownfield. Hoarding are the developer, about 3 developers sitting on 1,000 hectares of land that they haven't developed yet. And then the agricultural land and the fish pond, these are mostly in the northwestern part of the New Territory. Those are land that's still kind of mostly owned by the villagers and yet not developed yet. And then the others like the Funland was 172 hectares. So there are land. It's a question of how to secure this land from different stakeholders. And the government feeling is it's very difficult to negotiate from different parties, many parties, on pricing and what kind of arrangement with developer, who would do the infrastructure to make those land developable. And because of that, the government said, listen, if you look to the sea, when no one's living, we don't have this problem, right? There's no previous owner, then that's a path of least resistance. And therefore, let's do reclamation. So that's sort of the immediate driving factor for this idea of reclaiming land in the Lantau, off Lantau Island. Now, it's not really a new idea. It's not really a new idea. Actually, in the early 80s, when the government was deciding to build a new airport in Chek Lap Kok, the question is, how do we connect a new airport to the rest of Hong Kong and provide the city and infrastructure to support this transport hub? There are 2 options. One is to connect the airport, build a new and from Tung Chung connect to Hong Kong via the bridge to Tsing Yi and then to West Kowloon. And there'll be a new town in Tung Chung. The other option is to build a reclaimed island called the East Lantau Island to be reclaimed off the shore of East Lantau. And they will connect over the Lantau Mountain to the airport and then connect to the Hong Kong itself to Kennedy Town. So that was 1983. It makes sense then because of the demographic and economic condition of Hong Kong then. Now, since that time, Gordon Wu and Lee Ka-shing, two of the biggest developers of Hong Kong, proposed a grander scale to the to the colonial government under Governor Wilson then. And the government then Hong Kong is a little bit smarter than today. They realized that the question of do we need that, how expensive it is, and what is the impact on the environment. And they did not take on the project. And fast forward to 2014, the former chief executive, C.Y. Leung, reintroduced a project to call it East Lantau Metropolis, consisting of 1,000 hectares. And he immediately wanted to push it through LegCo, but it wasn't acted on. And nothing happened between that time until 2018, when our Hong Kong Foundation aggressively pushed a reclamation-centric development model. They introduced this enhanced East Lantau Metropolis in August 2018, even bigger than the original idea of consists of 2,200 hectares. Now, what is our Hong Kong Foundation? We should realize it's one of the most powerful lobbying organizations in Hong Kong, funded, chaired by Dong Jinhua, and supported by all the major developers, tycoons in Hong Kong. And they're extremely influential in the background of the Hong Kong government. And sure enough, a few months later, Carrie Lam increased the original ELM instead of 1,000 hectares to 1,700 hectares. Now, interestingly, you notice that 1,700 hectares is between 1,000 and 2,200. It leaves no doubt to me the extremely internal pressure to apply to Carrie Lam to meet Tom Yam halfway to a scheme that's bigger than the original ELM. Now, that got a lot of opposition and concern. So very quickly, this original vision of Lantau Tomorrow of 7 hectares become the phase 1 of the current Lantau vision. Phase 1 contains only about 1,000 hectares. So there we are. We're looking at this phase 1 that I will discuss a bit more what it means. Okay. Now, if you even accept this idea that we have no land, we need to build this city in the sea, how conceptually viable it is. Some of the detail. Now, the government haven't shown much detail on this project beyond the sheer minimal information. It's 1,000 hectares of reclaimed land. It has population up to 700,000 people, where 2/3 of its housing for public housing, and 1/3 for private housing. And it has a CBD. That's it. After 6 years, that's all the government is telling us in terms of the actual hardware of this project. Now, later I'll discuss how they sort of present the software. And cost about $624 billion to build it based on September of 2018 cost, which would really become $1 trillion when construction begins in 2025. Okay, so it costs more than a combined cost of the Hong Kong, Zhuhai, Macau bridge, the high-speed train to Guangzhou, and the third runway. And to kickstart the project, the government is asking for $550 million, like $500 million, to do a study now. So the question is, based on what we know, what do you think of the project? And are we in a position to spend this money, which is the remaining of my presentation? Well, if you look at the location of this project, it immediately strikes you that unlike other new towns, unlike other new development area, it's in the middle of the sea. Detached from all existing community. Okay. No country in the world I can think of that plan to have a city with 700,000 people about 5 kilometers from the shore. And the implication of this configuration is immense. Well, you know how things are in Hong Kong during the typhoon season. The minute we have number 8 signal, the people would immediately rush home. They would leave the office and go home. The picture on the upper left-hand corner is what we saw about 2 years ago in the typhoon Mengke. That's typical. Well, when we have a typhoon in Hong Kong. For Gary living in Discovery Bay and living with Wall, you see massive amount of people trying to get into transportation back into where they live. Now, the question is, how is it manageable in times of emergency when you have this isolated metropolis in the middle of the sea, in the era of global warming and rising sea level, right? Now, the Chat Lap Kok Airport was built about 6 meters above sea level. And during this kind of typhoon, it's almost reached the runway in terms of the water level. And there's nobody live there. Can you imagine in due course, we're actually seeing a metropolis being in the middle of the sea, like Venice. So from a geographic point of view, this is a very problematic configuration. Now, let's look at how the transportation network goes, right? In addition to serving the people of the Lantau Vision, it has support the traffic from Northwest New Territory and support those traffic through the tunnel to Hong Kong. It support the traffic between Hong Kong to the airport and West Kowloon to the airport. It's simply not possible to have this massive population and the supporting traffic to be handled by only 2 tunnels. One going between the Lantau Vision to Hong Kong and one to Lantau. To give you an example, in Qingyi, with less people, around the same area, 10 square kilometers, with 190,000 people, there are 5 bridges and 5 access roads between Qingyi and mainland Kowloon. So how is it possible for this metropolis with 700,000 people to include the traffic from Northwest New Territory and other places? So it's simply not workable in terms of the spatial configuration. Okay, but at a high level, most important question is, if you want to spend that money on a new piece of land, why? Is there some overarching strategic imperative? A lot of countries like Brazil, Myanmar, and Indonesia, who move the capital from one place to another, they don't start up by saying, hey, well, we're going to have a piece of land somewhere to build a city. They made the decision, we're going to move the capital from, say, Rio de Janeiro to Sao Paulo, from Yangon to Naypyidaw and Jakarta in the future, to East Kalimantan in Borneo. Now that's a strategic imperative. But for spending $1 trillion LTV, why? Just to build public housing? I used to work in Shanghai in Pudong when Pudong was being developed. When Shanghai wanted to make Pudong an international financial center, before they even developed the city, they moved the Shanghai Stock Exchange and the People's Bank of China, the central bank, to Pudong. That's a strategic statement that they will make the place an international financial center. Then people will plan to move there. But in this case, you're relying on starting with public housing. Why would the business community want to move to LTV? So that's very lacking in the strategic imperative to make this a success. Now, look at it. We know Hong Kong is going to have a declining population after 2043. The peak is only 8.2 million. That's because of the aging population, people getting married later, and fewer or no children. We are counting on the immigrant from China, the 150 per day of the family reunification. But even that amount of population is decreasing. Currently, there's only around 100 per day immigrant from China. So when we build LTV and in conjunction with the current planned development, like in the new development area and other planned capacity in the current new town, we will have a capacity of 9 million people, where the peak is only 8.2. So why are we spending $1 trillion to achieve overcapacity? Furthermore, it's not going to solve the near-term problem. This project takes at least 15 years to complete. So it won't help those people who are waiting for getting to public housing. It takes about 5.7 years now. So it won't help those people. And in the long term, based on the figure, the Development Secretary, Michael Wong, tells us, a private flat in LTV would cost $18 million or more. So if you cannot afford a flat in Hong Kong now, most people cannot, you will not be able to afford a flat in Lantau Tomorrow. And look at the area. On 1,000 hectares, there will be 70,000 people living in it. So on a per square kilometer basis, LTV will be more congested than the most congested district in Guntong, which is around 56,000 per square kilometer. Now, all these problematic concepts, I think, came from they lift a project from 1983. They used precisely the same parameters and without thinking, applied to a new city now. So you're not going to have a better quality of life in a new city. And talking about a CBD, can you think of a city in the world where there are 170,000 public housing surrounding a CBD? How is that going to invite the business community to move here? I cannot think of anyone, but perhaps your expert can inform me. Is there any place where this configuration exists? Now, okay, so from the geographic location, from the spatial network, and from the livability, I find it highly problematic. So let me switch gears a little quickly to the question of environmental impact. This involves reclamation. Very basic discussion. The way you do it, you need to remove the marine deposit in the upper layer of the sea, dredge those, dump it somewhere, and put fill material on top. That's how you. So from initially you have marine deposit at a hard base. You remove the top area, and then you build up the base by fill, become land. What happens when you do this? Surely you destroy the environment where you remove all the ecosystem in the area destroyed.
Tom,
but you have to deposit.
20 minutes into your presentation already.
I beg your pardon?
I said it's already 20 minutes into your presentation. I'm just reminding
I have, I think I have about 10 minutes left, right?
Yeah, okay.
Okay, it'll be done. So you remove these marine deposit, you put them somewhere. That somewhere will be destroyed when you take this excavated sledge. So you're destroying two areas, not just the area where you do reclamation. Okay. In fact, in the third runway that we've been building out, a third of the area of the land or the seabed been contaminated by the marine deposit they extract from building the Chetlapong airport. So right away, you're destroying two areas, not just one. And the next question is, where is the refill came from? Where is the reclamation fill come from? It come from another area. It come from either the sea sand, river sand, and you're destroying the area where you extract the fill material from. Now, there's another way of getting sand. We call it a machine sand. That basically you tear down the entire area, crunch the rock, crunch the sand to become fill. Again, when you do that, you're destroying the area where you extract the land sand. The community is gone. In Singapore, I'm sure a lot of you have been to the Marina Bay in Singapore. That whole area, about 300 hectares of reclaimed land, is made from river sand from Cambodia. So the entire mangrove forest villages in Cambodia been transported to create luxury development area. So the impact of reclamation is tremendous. You're destroying three areas, the area where you do the reclamation. And of course, when you reclaim land, you're narrowing the passageway of the area that create higher turbulence, more congested traffic for the shipping lane. And for the area that the reclaimed land enclosed, those become like Dead Sea because of lack of movement or lack of current. I live in Wirral, I'm sure Gary live in Discovery. You see time when they're all red tide, jellyfish, because of lack of oxygen, lack of movement of the water. So it is the Dead Sea. Now, some general in conclusion, there's some other planning issues which I don't have time to go into. The government basically using a very technical, factual, legal way to drive the project. Population, land, housing. That's it. They have no plan, no analysis how to transform something in the middle of the sea with no history, no culture, and lived experience to metropolis. How do you take something from nothing. No one lived there. No neighboring community as a to create organic growth. There's no analysis. What is the position? What's the role of Yale or the city with the rest of Hong Kong? None. And despite all the talk about regional integration, there's only one page entire 2013 plan to talk about the Greater Bay Area. And again, this project is a talk. There's no discussion from the local community in Lantau, none with the resident in Candytown. So entirely top down. And more importantly, there's no going back. There's no going back or reclamation. Once you've done it, that's it. And furthermore, there's no room for growth. You are confining the city. In the middle of the sea, should you need more land, you just cannot do it because you're narrowing and narrowing the water passageway. Unlike when you build a city, you have a new town, you can grow organically, expand the perimeter. In this case, you just cannot. So my question is, in summary, based on what we know so far, based on what we are presented by the government, are we ready to make a $1 trillion decision that really very ill prepared to convince us? So, you know, I'd be glad to, I'm sure the panelists has an opinion. So basically my conclusion is based on what we understand from geographic point of view, from the spatial point of view, livability point of view, and the impact on the environment, we should not go forward with this project. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. That was really well put, and you've actually kept your time. Sorry for reminding you earlier, because I thought it would be much longer than that. But you covered a lot of valid points, questioning the Lantau Tomorrow Vision, and from a strategic perspective, from an environmentalist perspective, from a spatial perspective, but also even if you take from a planning perspective, whether even touching like the next practice. It's actually looking at whatever we were used to developing in Hong Kong, right, and putting the same thing back on the plate. And the inflexibility and the cost, which is a huge amount. And I think what I would do now is to start the panel discussion. Maybe start with Peter before I share some thoughts later. I think I'll leave it to the end. Peter, you want to kind of take you know, this opportunity to actually go over some of the things.
Yeah, sure.
Your responses to Tom's presentation, as well as in general, even the, you know, touching base on the master plan of East Lantau Metropolis and stuff like that. Thank you.
Well, I certainly don't want to talk about the plan itself, which is still a little bit under wraps and it's still very conceptual. I think that was a great presentation, Tom. I agree with all of it at the outset. You have, as the Americans say, touched all the bases, really. So I think I'll come in, as Sujata suggests, really at an angle. And I guess there are three things, really. I mean, one is, you know, the projected housing need, the underlying demand itself, that we need to be confident, you know, about why we're doing it, not just what we're doing. And then we have, of course, you know, to look at alternative options for land supply, existing committed things that are already underway. Then, of course, we have the price that we put on environmental protection, and Tom talked really about, you know, the issues of environmental dredging and reclamation too. So, I mean, in terms of actual need, I mean, there are a number of factors, and I think this is absolutely crucial, because if you really go back to the basic issues that came out of the original, very conceptual study, there was no holistic thinking at all. Need really came out of nowhere. And I think just to give you a rough idea, you know, that over the, you know, even 10 to 15 years ago, government was still talking about a future population by the mid 2030s of somewhere like 9.1, 9.2 billion.
Right. Yeah,
that was revised in the 2030 study to about 8.2, 8.3. That's still 1 million more than we have at the moment. To give you an example, you know, in the 10 years prior to 2018, the number of public rental flats increased by about 91,000. But the interesting thing is that they only house, on average, 1.16 people. The average household size has gone down, and I think, you know, housing has a lot to do with demographics, and it's something that figures are available. They're available from government, from the university, but they don't seem to have been taken into proper consideration. Population growth through natural means, that is to say the difference between births and deaths, is around 0.4%, generating in Hong Kong only about 14,000 persons per annum. In fact, the population only grew by about 500,000 between 2001 and 2015, and it's gone down since then, as Tom made clear. It's projected by Hong Kong 2030 that deaths will exceed births by 2027, only 7 years away. The fertility rate is only 1.13 at the moment in Hong Kong. It's the 4th lowest in the world. And if you ask who the other 3 countries are, they're countries that you probably never even heard about. Between 20,000 and 25,000 people emigrate annually. And we might well, at the moment, trying to project forward, might well see a predicted increase in the immediate future. Almost the entire net annual increase in population up to 2019 was through essentially the 55,000 people, the 150 people a day who settled in Hong Kong under the one-way permit scheme. But even a year ago, before a lot of our problems started, that had virtually halved. And at the moment, it's way down below that.
107 per day, 107 per day now.
Yeah, well, that might be the latest figures. The latest figure I had was 75 a day.
Really? Wow.
And, you know, we've got to, you know, people can't just walk over the boundary. You know, so why would people be coming from China when they have probably better accommodation there and jobs and so on and so forth? I mean, you know, the original idea was that they, you know, they do have to go a process, they have to have relatives here and so on and so forth. So you could build up a very good argument that those who were coming to Hong Kong have already come. But, you know, I think we can leave that aside for the moment. But, you know, the fact is that the Hong Kong population has been relatively static now since 2015. And that 2030 projects that from 2027, deaths will outpace births. Now, Census and Statistics Department itself project a peak population of about 8.2 million in 2043. At the moment, the Department of Statistics and Actuarial Science at Hong Kong U is projecting a maximum population round about the same. But after that, a continual decline. And I think if the current one-way permit figures decrease even further, it's clear to me that we're not even looking at a population of 8 million by 2047.
No.
And there are many other factors too. I mean, they're vague, but they were saying, for example, just 2 months ago, Hong Kong's welfare minister announced, in fact, it was in June, that 230,000 people had applied for residence permit in the mainland. Now, of course, we know that there are quite a few people in Hong Kong who were inadequately housed. There are around 210,000 people living in subdivided units. That is to say, about 92,000 rooms subdivided into about 27,000 flats, many of which have been converted with very little regard to building and safety rules. 1 in 3 of these has a living area of only 5 square meters. So, you know, these figures clearly indicate where the focus and priority of our immediate attention should be. And much has been made on the waiting list for housing as well. I think it's fair to say that in 2005, 15 years ago, a quota and point system was introduced for non-elderly single person applicants. And that has led to a colossal rise in applications, particularly from young people who very naturally can't see any way to afford a private flat. Why are flats expensive in Hong Kong? Well, Tom did refer to the you know, old colonial system that we still have here. Last year, almost 55% of Hong Kong's total income came from selling land. And now, where else in the world could you ever draw a parallel to that? So, not surprisingly, developers buy land for billions of dollars, and housing has become increasingly expensive. And I think that's one of the reasons why, you know, an ambitious scheme like this is going forward. In fact, in the policy address, where the chief executive made almost 6 months before the end of the committee's study on land supply, she actually made the point that, you know, in the fullness of time, which has got to be at least 30 years away, I would have thought Hong Kong will be able to sell land and make the money back that it spent. I'd just like to say a few last words really on land supply, because I think that's a very crucial factor too. Government has identified, committed and planned developments. Now I know about this because we were working on 2 of these large areas, Hung Shih Kiew and Fanning North. They have designated population projections. The NDAs that Tom talked about in Kwutong North, Fanning North and Hung Shih Kiew, where we've been working for 3 years, provide for a total population of 394,000. Yuan Long South development is providing for 88,000. Kam Tim South, 37,000. Tung Chung Extension, 144,000. And of course, there are other sites too. I mean, you know, there's the population projections for Kowloon East, for example, are up for 134,000, and we've got a fraction of those there yet. So if we divide this total population of around 800,000 by the present average household size, it already gives a requirement for not more than 275,000 units. So we have the land for all that. And it's certainly enough to be getting on with. So, you know, I think really, what we can say really is that the way things are going at the moment, you know, we do have enough land. We have about 150,000. If you look at the number of private flats in the market, and you look at the number of households, again there is an enormous difference. There's about 200,000 technically empty apartments. Now, of course, we know that they're not empty. We know that people who need housing can't simply move into empty flats. But, you know, there are a lot of elements around this. If we were to rehouse as a priority the people who are very inadequately housed at the moment, presumably all those apartments that have been subdivided, there are 27,000 of them. So, you know, all these figures are really very, I think, interesting when you throw them into the equation.
Okay, Peter, yeah, okay, I was just going to ask you, thank you for that, because you've emphasized more on the housing need, that we actually don't need this much housing that they're talking about in Lantau Vision, and also the fact that there are other land resources with affordable housing that is being planned, actually, public housing, that, you know, it questions the validity of this
Yes.
vision. I would now ask Gary to actually, you know, focus maybe on the environmental aspect you mentioned that you would look into.
Thanks, Sujata. Well, where do we start? I mean, Tom, great presentation, really insightful. And yeah, I mean, where do we need to really add on? Even after just watching that and listening to Peter's words, I mean, the whole thing just seems like a big white elephant and a massive waste of funds, resources. But the environmental impact, as Tom rightfully pointed out, just the extraction process of where we're going to get all this land, the fill from, the destruction we're going to do to the actual ecosystem in that area, and the the delicate balance that we'll be upsetting. And that's not just there, but when we look around the world, or just even just around Hong Kong, we are constantly, I don't want to sound like a complete sort of tree-hugging hippie, but we are really messing with nature, and the continual messing with nature is going to have a detrimental effect, not just on us, but on the actual ecosystem itself. I mean, one of the things I keep seeing brought up with the project is the fact that it's of low ecological importance, this 1,700 hectares of land on 4 islands. I find that really baffling. A good friend of mine is Dr. Lindsay Porter. She does a lot of the work with the Chinese white dolphins and also the finless porpoises. And I've been working a lot with her recently on the finless porpoise, which is one of our cetaceans, a local cetacean. The lesser known, obviously the Chinese white dolphin is very popular, especially with the Olympics. But it is completely being overlooked. There are less than 200 animals in the last count that they put out. They are in threat. We had 43 animals wash up dead just last year. Alarm bells should be ringing for that, and that's another project I'm working on at the moment. But Lindsay had acoustic monitoring in the area where the project is at Mangkok, Peng Chau, and Khao Yi Chau. And the interesting thing is, when we look at the impact on the wildlife, a lot of people only look during the day, but actually, obviously, wildlife's there for 24 hours a day. And, different species use it for different reasons. Either it's a foraging area or it's a nursing area, a nesting area for birds, things like that. But every single day, we had acoustic readings from finless porpoises on every single one of those monitoring stations. So it's a very key habitat for the finless porpoise. We also know another key area of that is West Lama. So that whole area is a hotbed. We've also got the white-bellied sea eagles there. We've got sea pens. There's even a burrowing lizard that was found in the area. And on Sunshine Island, the government even made it a site of scientific special interest. So to say that it's of an ecologically low importance, I think is stretching it a bit. Hailing Chow, because it is actually a prison island and it's off the bounds of the, for public, you can't go on there. Wildlife is thriving. So that's smack bang in the middle of the area. But when we talk about the actual effect of having these islands, when we look at the current flows, as Tom rightfully pointed out, as we start to narrow these areas, we are changing the natural flow of the water system. Anybody wants to go and stand under Ching Ma Bridge and have a look at the rate of knots coming through there of water as the tide's rushing out. I've been there in my rib, my speedboat, and I have to have it in half forward just to stay stationary. The narrowing of any corridor where there's a large amount of water coming through, and not to mention a large amount of shipping uses the channel coming up from the West Lama Channel, or So we're narrowing the area. We've got an intense load of shipping, and we're also now building an incinerator on Seku Chau, and all of the city's trash is going to be taken on barges across there. So we're just complicating the whole area. But the dead zones and things like that, as we said with the typhoons, tidal surges, things like that, as soon as they get narrow, those surges get a lot bigger and obviously a lot more destructive. Also, the narrowing also builds up silt and sediment inside these channels. So that will make it shallower, bigger storm surges, more damage. So ecologically wise, I think it's a disaster, basically.
Thank you, Gary. That was, you kind of went directly to the point. saying that how ecologically it can be quite damaging to do these not 1, 2, 3 islands actually in the area, and also complicating the entire marine transport, but also the marine life more importantly, as well as the ecological balance in the area. I also wanted to question the whole idea of the CBD, having another CBD in this area. Do we really need it? Because to me, I think you have Hong Kong Harbor, Victoria Harbor, and you have several nodes around it. And the way I look at it is like many other people also think similarly. We have Hong Kong Central, you have Kowloon, Hong Kong East and Hong Kong West that could be developed further. And then you have, you know, on the Kowloon side, you have Kowloon East and Kowloon West. Could, you know, there's opportunity to develop like, you know, a little bit further there. And together with these 6 nodes, you already have a fantastic CBD as a whole, which could become like the most unique CBD in the world. And why would you throw away this opportunity and then come back to build a new CBD somewhere else and create all these ecological and environmental problems, and also at a huge cost, which Tom, you know, rightly pointed out. And especially now, I think post-COVID, right? If we are really looking at it, there are 2 issues here. One, I think Tom already mentioned, is about the looking in the context of Greater Bay Area. You know, what should be happening? Should we still need this Lantau vision happening in this area, or you look at Hong Kong overall and how it fits into JBA? The other question is post-COVID. What have we learned in this COVID situation? A lot of what we are doing now could change in terms of working patterns, in terms of the way we you know, consume office space. Maybe we need actually bigger housing areas. Peter, we need more square meters per apartment, actually, bigger
Yes.
flat sizes for sure.
Quality, not just quantity.
Yeah, yeah, and like you mentioned, you know, each unit houses 1.1. Whenever it's 1.1 or something, it's like, to me, it's 1 person. That's it. So it's so you really need actually more bigger size flats. And the other thing is, Tom, you mentioned it will take 12 years. I think it'll take much longer than that, right? By the time anything happens in these islands. So the current need cannot be met with this Lantau vision. So I think these are a lot of issues that need to be addressed. And there are some other interesting questions from the audience participants. One of the things they've asked is, what do you think of the political will at government level to push this project ahead right after COVID stabilizes? I'll just read there are 3 questions basically. I think maybe it's better to read all the 3 and then try to address them. The other was specifically on reclamation, referring back to Tom's undersea section, which is there a better way of reclaiming with lesser ecological impacts? And the other question is, I think, which Gary kind of mentioned already, about the environmental impacts and the busy transport existing corridors. How do development in this area on Lantau or other less developed areas should be favored for study first before anything is actually done, before going into actually developing it. So these are the 3 questions. And I want you to respond to the CBD question as well, because I think it's, you know, kind of taking away what Hong Kong has and trying to put it somewhere else and hoping that in 20, 30 years, something will happen there. Anybody wants to address?
Yes, well, I'll dive in again. I completely agree with you about putting CBD3 on an offshore island surrounded by several 100,000 public rental flats. It seems rather strange. There is an enormous capacity still in Hong Kong. CBD2, as you say, is Kowloon East with Kai Tak. and Kwantong, of course, which is rapidly developing into a CBD too. So, you know, I think we're miles away from really, you know, sensibly looking for such a, you know, such an alternative, which would be so difficult to both develop and to access. I think on the question of will, it's interesting, and I think we would have to say that nobody really knows. I hate to say this, but I'm really quite cynical about our ability to think strategically and really project needs. Now, I'm not saying that's an easy thing to do in Hong Kong. You know, I've been in Hong Kong more than 40 years, and you know, working on the early new towns, nobody had any idea at all what the population growth in Hong Kong was going to be. But I think we can read a lot between the lines. I'm very unhappy when I really feel that strategic development is moving forward really without a proper assessment of need. And of course, we can look at it in so many ways. One is that we have the Greater Bay Area on the doorstep. Now, it seems to be taken as a fact, which I think is actually wrong, that people in Hong Kong simply don't want to go and live there. Well, we're doing a lot of work in the Greater Bay Area. I can tell you investment is pouring in. The population that is supported by this skeleton of trunk roads, bridges, high-speed rail lines is actually in place already. At least 95% of it is. And Beijing is saying that, you know, the population is going to double from about 60 million to 120 million. There is a lot going on. And I think it's almost inconceivable that people will not be working there. I think if we were to look at things constructively, we should really be talking about helping Hong Kong people to move over the border. And this periodically sort of is raised in the media as well. There is a trend of more Hong Kong people going to live there. I was reading some statistics from a youth survey the other day, and it seems to be coming out with quite the opposite result that we seem to hear in the press. That 50% of young people would certainly be happy to work in the Greater Bay Area, and a great proportion of them would be happy to live there as well. And when you look at the quality of housing in particular, you know, people might be a little bit fearful about actually putting down residence in China, but the evidence is that a lot of older people are already doing that. So, I mean, I think while I'm here, I'd just like to come back just to come back on one or two other points that Tom made. Yes, we do have, you know, I think a very, very overcrowded urban area, and it seems to me that this has got even more overcrowded really over the last 2 or 3 years. You know, if only built-up areas, which account, as Tom said, for about 24% of our land, are taken into account. Our density is 27,300 persons per square kilometre. It's the highest in the world. If you compare it to Singapore, Singapore only has 40% of Hong Kong's built-up density. Shenzhen only has 25%. So, you know, we already do have, you know, this massive, population actually living in this 24% of land where we all live, we recreate, we work, and so on and so forth. So it's not surprising we all feel this pressure. I think in that sense, there's another important point to make. You know, if we extract all the built-up areas and the country parks and so on, by my calculation, you know, we should have about 250 square kilometers of unobstructed land. Well, of course, we don't. You know, we're left with this amalgam of unplanned village, small house expansion, non-recognized settlement, together with hundreds of millions of square feet owned by private interests. You know, I was reading a report just the other day by the LIBA research community, which had mapped 42,000 NT small houses, and found that almost 10,000 involved illegal trading of small house rights to developers. And we must remember that this already compounds a wasteful an environmentally disastrous situation in the NT that's floundered along for 40 years, and government really seems to back off doing anything about it. And a recent audit commission identified the rather depressing fact that there are 500,000 people living in these areas, living in brownfield areas and small house enclaves. That is to say, the 500,000 people are living in 70,000 village houses using unlicensed septic tanks. And all this discharged sewage is going directly into water bodies. And private developers, as Tom said, are owning land, around all this mess. Just one last point. Yes, I do agree that, again, it's an unknown quality. I don't know what our chief executive says when she's on a duty visit to Beijing. But common sense dictates that we should be talking in a positive way to Beijing about some of these issues. They're overriding ones. If we are so short of what we think our housing needs are, then can we find another way around? Well, there is another way around. We have 19 PLA sites in Hong Kong. The largest one is Qingshan, it's near Chuen Mun. It accommodates about 80% of the total garrison area. Now, Article 13 of the Garrison Law states that if military land is no longer used for military purposes, it should be turned over without compensation to Hong Kong. Now, if we are in such need, then surely we can be talking about the possibility of that. Not now, not in 10 years, not in 20 years. We have enough housing land for the next 25 to 30 years, by my calculation. Anything post 2047, it's on the cards, isn't it, really? So why couldn't we be using that as a component to be planning 30 years hence?
I think, Tom, I want to give you, chance to respond. But the question, I should also say, one of the participants mentioned, why build islands when you can densify Lantau?
Yeah, absolutely.
Rather than create all these problems on the marine ecological impacts as well as the marine transport. So you want to address those issues, Tom, and then Gary, quickly, we are running out of time.
So the question is, what other option, right? What's the alternative if we don't do the Lantau vision, right? That's the question.
Yeah, the question is, why not densify Lantau rather than build the islands? That was one of the questions.
I mean, why not develop Lantau itself?
Yeah.
Okay. Good question. Lantau, even though the geography is mostly mountainous in the middle, right? About 150, Lantau is about 150 square kilometer. 80% has gradient of 3 or 4 degrees or more, and no developer want to develop that way. The only land available in Lantau is in the northern shore, Dongchong and Dongchong Extension, and in the south, Mui Wo, Discovery Bay. In the middle, there are 2 country parks, North Lantau Country Park and South Lantau Country Park. And those 2 country parks, in conjunction with other mountainous areas, there's really no room for big development. No. Okay. I think, Gary, you're familiar very much with Lantau. I think you probably agree with that.
Gary?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I've been thinking about whereabouts to put it, but I did read some reports, and I'm not sure how accurate they are, that even just by using brownfield sites, it was going to cost, the budget would be about 25% of the actual cost of what's proposed. I mean, that in itself blows me away, that we could take these derelict areas and build exactly the same thing for a quarter of the price without the ecological impact. In fact, you'd actually be cleaning up a lot of these areas that, as like Peter said, the sewage management there alone is an ecological nightmare as it is.
Okay. Do you want to address the reclamation question about, like, can the reclamation process be done in a way there's a lesser impact?
Okay. Okay. The government, see, here's how government behaves. They have no overall plan, but when people ask a question, they'll make up an answer on the fly. So on the question of reclamation, the government said, okay, we won't use sea sand to destroy environment. we're going to use construction material waste. Okay, fine, but the answer is not enough. To reclaim 1,000 hectares of land, you need 260 million tons of fill. Our construction waste every year, only about 15 million tons. So the construction waste of Hong Kong is never, ever going to be enough for reclamation. We still end up destroying some other environment just so we have enough sand to create our own reclamation.
I think before I don't know, Vicky mentioned that we need to end around this time. I have just one other question that we should discuss before we end, which is about public engagement, community engagement. This was obviously like something that came up from top down. And then, it's not actually fully, although the study itself did some engagement exercises. What are your views on the actual, what Hong Kong people as overall, not just people in Lantau, overall
Okay.
Hong Kong, what do they, really want for Hong Kong?
Good question. When the government have engagement, either it's a twisted engagement or they ignore the result. Let me give an example. There was a consultation on the 2011-2012 strategic land supply, in which there's a question, would you support reclamation? There were 3 surveys. Out of the 3 surveys, 2 came back, Hong Kong people do not want reclamation. 2 out of 3. And yet the government proclaimed that, well, there are general support for reclamation. That's one case. And about 3 years ago, there was a consultation on Lantau development. The feedback came back, majority opposed Lantau Tomorrow. And yet the government still move forward, right? So there are 2 cases that despite the consultation, which itself is kind of rigged, they ignore the result. So, we feel kind of pretty angry and helpless. So what's the point of consultation? You just ignore the result.
I have a suggestion before we end, just Vicky, one last thing. Suppose we actually address all the issues that have been raised here. That is, look at the land resources that we already have and look at the, and satisfy the current housing need with, and then look at how Hong Kong can actually work within GBA and reposition Hong Kong itself. And then later, like maybe, by another 20, 30 years from now, we may not even need another Lantau island to be reclaimed because all the needs have been satisfied where we are, even including a CBD around the harbor. So I just want you to have just briefly, maybe one word about that before we close. I'm thinking, Vicky, we should be closing soon.
Right? Actually, one more question from Rex. Sujata, if you wanted to go down, it's about Macau.
Oh, I didn't see that. Sorry. Okay, I'll be reading these. Maybe you can respond to that, but there are a few more questions. What is the state of marine environment in Hong Kong Harbor now and around Lantau Island, specifically asked to Gary? Then there is another question. I'm just going to read these 3 before we can, continue. One of the questions is, Macau has reclaimed land aggressively in recent years to support their economic, education, and housing.
Very shallow.
How do you see the similarities of differences comparing Hong Kong Lantau plans to Macau? Then another question from Daly is like, that was from Rex. So Daly says, how far along are we in this? How do we stop it? And there's another question. It's, it's a response to something. It's not that difficult, compulsory purchase.
Well, I can address the Macau question.
Yeah.
It's a typical question they raise. What about Macau? What about Singapore? They engage huge reclamation, right? Well, the answer is Singapore and Macau have no choice. Singapore is an island, and Macau is an island, a very narrow land connection to China. So they have no choice. If they want land, they have to reclaim. I just show you in Hong Kong, even new territory alone is bigger than Singapore. So Hong Kong has much more option to secure land than Macau or Singapore does. So that's not a valid comparison.
Okay, Gary, you want to answer the marine environment question?
Yeah, I mean, what we've seen since the we had the trawling ban that came into place 2012, the end of 2012, 2013. And what we're seeing is the ocean's actually rebounding. I mean, nature does rebound very quickly when you give it a chance. And we are starting to see that to the point where we're actually getting illegal fishing boats coming over from the mainland, which is something I've been dealing with the Hong Kong police. So our oceans are starting to bounce back. Just last Saturday, we had whale shark passing through. Yeah, so I mean, we're seeing it bounce back. So we don't need to be going backwards. I think just to summarize.
Okay. I mean, you know, but what about the suggestion I had earlier? Address all the needs within Hong Kong now, and then later you might realize that we don't even need Lantau Vision.
Yes, I think if I could make a couple of points there in relation to the first two questions. I mean, the first is that it is possible to actually de-link some of the areas that have been proposed as part of this vast parcel of reclamation works, particularly the Lung Fu Tan and the Chun Mun Western River Trade Terminal areas that I think could still actually go ahead, and they will be much easier because they're associated with the landmass rather than an island reclamation. I'd just like to talk about public consultation in perhaps a little bit of an abstract way. It's very difficult to consult on something like this, but you know, we have had this, nobody's mentioned really, but we have had this pretty extensive year-long task force on land supply. I think very unfortunately it was sort of chaired by a banker, which isn't necessarily the best person to chair these things, but I think, you know, the problem is it identifies opportunity areas. That was its remit. Its remit was not to take the sort of holistic approach that we're talking about now, that maybe should also have consulted the public. You know, the purpose of a holistic approach was that it would actually bring together informed projections of need and cost-effective means of at least medium-term supply. You know, the committee came up with 18 land supply options, and I've read the report, and half were described as conceptual or even controversial. A number of these were less than feasible, and at least on some counts, you know, many of them weren't really very desirable as well. So, you know, all of the sites that have actually been identified in that report offer only very limited development capacity. And to be frank, I mean, there were some very peculiar ones too. I mean, an attempt to concrete over even part of one of the territory's most prestigious resources, the Hong Kong Golf Club, of which incidentally I am not a member, for a relatively small number of housing units would make, you know, it would make Hong Kong, and the government like to call it Hong Kong as a world city. I mean, this would make Hong Kong into a world laughingstock, frankly.
Okay. Tom, you want to address this? How far along are we in this, and how do we stop?
Well, you know, actually, in the previous long-term study that was published in 2007, I think that's the Peter referred to. In that study, which assumed a larger population, a conclusion that Hong Kong had no more future need of high-intensity new town, and Hong Kong should develop into a distributed arrangement of many new development areas, but not a huge new town. So that conclusion, they proceed to have NDA instead of a high-intensity new town. So in fact, they knew the solution already. They recommended about 13 years ago, but somehow things change when they published the new long-term study. So actually, they have the answer. They just have to, you know, implement it. Okay.
And we already have land available for about
exactly.
175,000 new units.
Yeah. So you don't have to look too hard. It's there.
I think I want to take this opportunity to thank all the panelists and Tom for your detailed presentation up front. And Vicky, I want to hand it over to you to actually maybe say something about AIA and then close probably.
Okay. Well, thank you, Sujata. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Gary, and thank you, Peter. It has been really wonderful.
And we should thank the participants also. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
There are quite a few.
So, this webinar has been recorded. We will be uploading it onto YouTube. So for people who have missed it, and if you want to share it to people to learn more about this project, we will share the link on our YouTube AIA channel as well. And just for your information, AIA Hong Kong will be closing our honor and award within 2 weeks. So for all the architects within our committee, if you wanted to submit your urban planning ideas, architectural ideas, architectural project, interior project, or unbuilt idea, please, you have 2 more weeks to submit, and we're looking forward to your submission. And this will be a very exciting year to actually see all this new project that all the members are doing in Hong Kong and in Asia. So well, thank you again, and have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Stay safe, Sujata, over there.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Gary. Thank you, Vicky, and all the participants for tuning in.